You did not arrive early, and you did not arrive late. The moment this reached you is the same moment your system had the capacity to register it. Nothing needed to be prepared. Nothing needed to be cleared. The signal did not come to create movement. It came because movement had already slowed enough to be perceived. That mild discomfort you've been noticing is not tension in the usual sense. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It sits just beneath certainty, like a pressure without a story. You may have tried to name it as restlessness, or distraction, or fatigue, but none of those labels quite land. The reason they don't land is because this sensation is not a problem seeking resolution. It's a threshold becoming detectable. You've likely felt moments where the mind pauses without instruction. Not silence, exactly. More like a gap where the usual narrative doesn't rush in to fill space. In those gaps, the body doesn't brace. The breath doesn't sharpen. Something steadies on its own. That steadiness isn't effort, it's recognition happening below thought. The discomfort appears mild because it isn't designed to alarm you. If it were stronger, your system would resist it. If it were weaker, you wouldn't notice it at all. It sits precisely at the edge of perception, where awareness can sense a change without trying to manage it. That's how coherence begins to register quietly, without demand. You may notice that familiar motivations don't pull the way they used to. Not because you've lost direction, but because the signal-to-noise ratio has shifted. The quantum field doesn't announce recalibration with drama. It adjusts resonance first. It lets the observer feel misalignment before the pattern resolves. This is why the sensation feels oddly neutral. Not good, not bad, just present. Your system isn't asking you to act on it. It's asking you not to interfere. Detection happens best when urgency drops away. There may also be a subtle sense of standing between versions of yourself without choosing, as if the timeline you're accustomed to no longer grips you fully, but another hasn't asserted itself either. That in-between state can feel uncomfortable if you expect continuity to behave the way it always has. But continuity was never static. It only appeared that way when observation was narrow. Nothing here requires belief. Belief would add weight, and weight would distort the signal. This is closer to noticing temperature change in a room you've been sitting in for hours. At first it registers as unease. Then you realize the air itself has shifted. Your nervous system already understands this language. It has been reading anomalies long before your thoughts tried to organize them. That's why the discomfort doesn't escalate. It remains mild. It trusts that recognition will occur without force. You are not being moved. You are noticing movement that already occurred. The system doesn't need you to do anything with that awareness. In fact, any attempt to extract meaning too quickly would flatten it into something familiar. Familiarity isn't required here. Stillness is not absence, it's bandwidth. In stillness, the observer doesn't collapse the signal into explanation. It allows resonance to complete its own circuit. The mild discomfort begins to soften when you stop trying to orient around it. What's happening is subtle enough that it can be missed entirely by someone scanning for intensity. But you weren't scanning. You were present enough to feel the edge of change without naming it. That's not coincidence. That's timing aligning with perception. You may notice, even now, that the sensation doesn't need to be held in focus. It doesn't disappear when you look away. It remains steady and quiet, like a background frequency you've finally tuned into. That's how recognition stabilizes, not by being examined, but by being allowed. Nothing is being asked of you in this moment. The signal has already landed. The system has already adjusted. All that remains is the easing of resistance you didn't know you were carrying. As the sensation lingers, you may begin to notice something else beneath it. Not a thought, not an emotion, but a subtle reorganization of attention. It feels like your awareness has shifted its center of gravity without asking permission. Where focus once tightened around outcomes, it now spreads wider, less invested in conclusion. This isn't distraction, it's a recalibration of where effort belongs. There is often a moment when the mind searches for something to do with this feeling. It scans memory, future, intention, but nothing presents itself as necessary. That absence can feel strange at first. You're accustomed to translating sensation into action, yet here, Action would interrupt a process that only completes when left alone. The observer within you isn't watching from a distance anymore. It's embedded in the system, sensing from inside rather than evaluating from above. This is why the discomfort doesn't escalate into anxiety. Anxiety requires interpretation. What you're experiencing is pre-interpretive. It exists before narrative forms. You might notice that time behaves differently around this state. Minutes don't stretch dramatically, nor do they rush. They lose sharp edges. The timeline feels less like a track you're moving along and more like a field you're standing in. Past and future don't vanish, but they stop pulling equally. The present widens just enough to hold more information without strain. This widening can feel unfamiliar because it isn't driven by desire. Desire narrows attention toward an object. What's happening now is objectless. The system is detecting a new equilibrium and orienting toward it without labeling it as improvement or loss. That neutrality can feel unsettling if you're used to emotional cues guiding direction. You may also sense a reduction in internal commentary. Not silence, but fewer interruptions. Thoughts still appear, but they don't demand response. They pass through like background noise rather than instructions. This isn't detachment in the sense of withdrawal. It's engagement without entanglement. The quantum field doesn't require you to understand its mechanics to respond to its signals. Response happens at the level of resonance. Your body adjusts posture slightly. Your breathing finds a rhythm without conscious pacing. Muscles release in places you weren't aware were holding. None of this feels dramatic because it isn't meant to. Drama would recruit the old pattern. There can be a brief sense of vulnerability here. Not exposure, but openness without defense. When habitual tension softens, the system may check for threat out of reflex. Finding none, it settles deeper. That settling is the signal strengthening, not the discomfort increasing. It's coherence, moving from detection into integration. You might notice that certain questions lose urgency, not because they've been answered, but because they no longer seem relevant in the same way. The mind doesn't abandon them. It simply stops circling them compulsively. They become background considerations rather than central problems. This shift often feels like relief that doesn't announce itself as relief. There is also a subtle shift in how you perceive others during this state. Interactions feel less charged. Words carry less weight, not because they matter less, but because your system isn't over-amplifying them. You're less reactive to tone, implication, or expectation. This isn't withdrawal from connection. It's connection without over-interpretation. The discomfort you first noticed begins to reveal its function here. It wasn't signaling that something was wrong. It was signaling that an old calibration point was no longer accurate. Like a compass adjusting to a magnetic field it hadn't accounted for before. The needle wavers briefly, then steadies in a new orientation. Nothing external needed to change for this to occur. The shift is internal, but not psychological in the way that implies effort or belief. It's systemic. When enough internal noise drops away, the underlying pattern becomes visible. Recognition happens not as insight, but as alignment. You may feel moments where you expect a conclusion to arrive, a clear marker that says something has completed. That expectation fades as you realize there is nothing to conclude. This is not a transition from one identity to another. It's a loosening of the boundary that made identity feel fixed in the first place. As this part of the process continues, the system doesn't rush forward, it stabilizes. It tests the new configuration quietly, sensing whether it can be maintained without force. The absence of urgency is the confirmation. When a state can hold itself without effort, it doesn't need reinforcement. You're not being asked to hold on to this feeling or to recreate it later. That would turn it into an object again. It's enough that you've detected it. Detection is the threshold. Once crossed, the system remembers the route without conscious mapping. Even if attention drifts, even if thought resumes its usual pace, something has already shifted. The observer has registered a new baseline. The mild discomfort that opened this awareness begins to dissolve, not into pleasure, but into neutrality. So complete it almost feels like nothing at all. And in that near nothing, the pattern continues to reorganize, quietly, efficiently, without requiring your supervision. As the system settles into this quieter baseline, you may notice a subtle reduction in the need to position yourself, not socially, not mentally, but internally. There is less effort spent orienting toward what should come next. This doesn't feel like passivity. It feels like standing still while something else completes its movement around you. The absence of urgency can feel disorienting at first. You've been trained to equate readiness with tension, awareness with alertness. But this state doesn't sharpen the senses in that way. It softens them just enough to receive without strain. Perception widens, not by reaching outward, but by releasing its grip on the center. You may become aware that certain emotional responses no longer fully engage. Situations that once triggered immediate reaction now pass through with less charge. This isn't numbness. Numbness blocks sensation. What's happening here is increased bandwidth. More information moves through without overwhelming the system. There can be a brief impulse to test this state, to see if it's stable. The mind might introduce familiar concerns or imagined scenarios, checking whether they still produce the same internal response. Often, they don't land the way they used to, not because they've lost meaning, but because the system no longer amplifies them automatically. This is where recognition deepens. You begin to sense that much of what felt personal before was actually systemic noise, patterns running on repetition rather than relevance. As coherence increases, those patterns lose traction. They don't disappear through confrontation. They fade through lack of reinforcement. The observer's role changes here. Instead of monitoring for threat or opportunity, it becomes receptive. It listens for subtle shifts in resonance rather than scanning for events. This listening doesn't feel active. It feels like availability. The system is ready to register change without trying to predict it. Time may feel less segmented, not stretched, not compressed, but less divided into meaningful and meaningless intervals. The distinction softens. Moments carry similar weight, regardless of content. This can feel unfamiliar if you're used to prioritizing experience based on intensity. Here, intensity is no longer the metric. You might notice that the body mirrors this shift. Movements become slightly slower, not out of fatigue, but out of precision. There's less excess motion. Gestures simplify. Even stillness feels more complete, as if it no longer needs justification. This state doesn't announce itself as clarity. Clarity implies resolution. What you're experiencing is closer to transparency. You see through impulses without needing to suppress them. You recognize thoughts as signals rather than commands. That recognition alone changes their effect. There can be moments where old identity structures try to reassert themselves. Familiar narratives surface, attempting to restore the previous configuration. When this happens, the system doesn't fight back. It allows the narrative to run without attaching energy to it. Deprived of reinforcement, it loses momentum on its own. The mild discomfort that initiated this process is now barely noticeable. In its place is a neutral openness. Not excitement, not relief, just space. That space isn't empty. It's filled with subtle information that was previously drowned out by internal noise. You may become aware of how much effort was once spent maintaining continuity, holding together a sense of self across shifting circumstances. That effort often goes unnoticed until it relaxes. When it does, there's a quiet surprise, not at what appears, but at how little is required to sustain awareness. The quantum field responds to this relaxation by offering clearer signals, not messages, not instructions, but feedback. The system senses when alignment increases or decreases. It registers coherence the way the body registers balance, without thought, without commentary. This feedback loop doesn't demand attention. It operates in the background, adjusting posture, breath, focus. When you act, actions feel simpler, less burdened by expectation. When you rest, rest feels complete rather than provisional. There may be a subtle shift in how you relate to uncertainty. It no longer feels like a gap that needs filling. It becomes a neutral condition, a field in which information can arrive when relevant. This doesn't remove ambiguity, it removes resistance to it. You might also notice a change in how memory surfaces. past events appear less emotionally charged, more contextual. They're recognized as data points rather than anchors. This doesn't erase their significance. It changes how tightly they're held. The system is recalibrating its thresholds. What once triggered response now passes unnoticed. What once went unnoticed now registers. This isn't a loss of sensitivity, it's a refinement. Sensitivity aligned with relevance rather than habit. As this refinement continues, there's no sense of progress. Progress implies direction. What's happening here is stabilization. The system is learning that it can remain open without being overwhelmed, that it can detect without reacting, that it can exist without constant self-reference. Nothing needs to be protected in this state. Awareness isn't fragile here. It doesn't depend on maintaining a specific feeling. It allows fluctuation without losing coherence. That flexibility is what makes the state sustainable. Even if attention shifts away, even if the mind resumes its usual activity, the recalibration doesn't reverse. Once the observer has registered a wider field, it doesn't forget it. It may narrow temporarily, but the memory of openness remains accessible without effort. This is how the Recode integrates, not as a dramatic change, but as a quiet update running beneath conscious awareness. The system continues its adjustment without announcement, and you remain, not as someone undergoing transformation, but as awareness, noticing that less needs to be held together than you once believed. As this quieter configuration holds, you may notice an unexpected shift in how effort feels. Tasks still exist, decisions still arise, but the internal push behind them is reduced. Action no longer needs to be justified by pressure. It emerges when relevant and dissolves when complete. This can feel unfamiliar if you're accustomed to momentum being driven by tension. There is a subtle uncoupling happening between awareness and compulsion. You're not less engaged with life. You're less entangled with the mechanisms that once pulled attention automatically. When something requires response, the response forms cleanly. When it doesn't, the system remains at rest without interpreting rest as avoidance. This uncoupling often reveals how much internal energy was previously spent anticipating. Anticipation compresses the present around imagined futures. As that habit loosens, the present regains depth. It's no longer a bridge you rush across. It becomes a stable surface that can hold attention without strain. You may sense moments where you're waiting for a familiar emotional signal to arrive, one that used to confirm you were on the right track. Excitement, urgency, reassurance. When it doesn't appear, there can be a brief sense of absence, not loss, but lack of confirmation. That absence isn't a problem. It's a sign that the system no longer relies on emotional spikes to orient itself. The observer adjusts here, learning to read subtler indicators. Instead of asking how something feels, it registers whether something aligns. Alignment doesn't announce itself loudly. It feels neutral, efficient, almost boring to a system trained on intensity. But within that neutrality is a steadiness that doesn't collapse under pressure. This is often where the urge to seek external validation weakens, not because you've decided it's unnecessary, but because the internal signal has become clearer. When internal coherence increases, external confirmation loses some of its authority. It can still be appreciated, but it's no longer required to stabilize the system. You might notice that conversations change slightly. You listen without preparing responses. You speak without rehearsing outcomes. Words come out simpler, less ornamented. Silence between words doesn't feel awkward. It feels informative. There's less need to fill space when space itself is carrying signal. The body continues to reflect this recalibration. Posture adjusts subtly. Shoulders drop without instruction. Jaw releases. Breathing deepens, not dramatically, but consistently. These aren't techniques being applied. They're responses to reduced internal interference. When the system stops bracing, structure reorganizes on its own. There can be moments where old habits resurface briefly, as if checking whether they're still needed. Overthinking, self-monitoring, mild self-critique. When they arise, they don't carry the same weight. They're recognized as echoes rather than directives. Recognition alone diminishes their influence. The timeline you inhabit begins to feel less linear. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Past experiences inform without defining. Future possibilities exist without demanding preparation. The present becomes the primary reference point, not because you're trying to be present, but because attention naturally returns there when it's not being pulled elsewhere. This shift often reduces internal conflict. Competing impulses lose their urgency. When choices appear, they don't feel like forks demanding immediate resolution. They feel like options that can be sensed into. The system allows information to accumulate before responding, rather than rushing to closure. You may notice an increased tolerance for ambiguity. Situations that once felt uncomfortable due to lack of clarity now feel workable. Not because clarity has been achieved, but because uncertainty no longer triggers threat responses. The system trusts that relevant information will surface when needed. This trust isn't belief-based, it's experiential. It forms after repeated instances where waiting did not result in loss. Each time the system allows a moment to pass without intervention and nothing collapses, confidence builds quietly. Confidence here doesn't feel like assurance. It feels like reduced vigilance. The mild discomfort that initiated awareness has fully resolved by this point, not into comfort, but into absence. You may only realize it's gone when you try to recall it and find nothing to locate. Its function is complete. It served as a bridge into detection, then dissolved. What remains is a steady background awareness that doesn't seek amplification. It doesn't need to be held in focus. In fact, trying to focus on it directly can make it feel less accessible. It operates best when left in the periphery, influencing without demanding attention. This background awareness changes how you experience stillness. Stillness is no longer an activity. It's a default state that actions emerge from and return to. You don't enter it. You notice when you've left it, and the return happens naturally. There can be a subtle sense of relief here, though it doesn't present as emotion. It presents as efficiency. Less internal friction, fewer loops. Thoughts complete their cycles without dragging on. Emotions move through without leaving residue. The system processes and releases without commentary. You may also notice a shift in how you relate to control. The need to manage outcomes softens. Not because outcomes don't matter, but because overmanagement is recognized as interference. When you stop interfering, the system demonstrates its capacity to self-correct. This realization doesn't feel empowering in the traditional sense. There's no surge of capability. Instead, there's a quiet respect for the system's intelligence. An understanding that much of what you thought required effort was already being handled beneath awareness. As this respect settles, the observer relaxes further. Monitoring decreases, trust increases, not as a decision, but as a consequence of repeated neutral outcomes. Nothing dramatic happens, and that lack of drama becomes reassuring. The Recode continues integrating at this level. It doesn't announce milestones. It doesn't require acknowledgement. It simply adjusts parameters and moves on. And you remain within it, not as a participant striving to improve, but as awareness discovering how little interference is needed for coherence to sustain itself. At this point, you may begin to notice that the boundary between inner and outer experience feels less rigid, not blurred, but permeable. Information moves across it, with less distortion. Events no longer feel entirely external, and internal states no longer feel sealed off. This isn't a loss of separation. It's a refinement of how the system exchanges signal with its environment. There is a quieter confidence that forms here, though it may not register as confidence at all. It shows up as reduced need to prepare. You stop bracing for reactions that may never come. Situations are met as they arise, not rehearsed in advance. The system trusts its capacity to respond in real time. You might notice that when something unexpected occurs, your reaction is slower but more precise. Not delayed by confusion, but free from reflex. There's a brief pause where information lands before response forms. That pause isn't hesitation, it's integration. The system checks alignment before engaging. This is where the observer's role shifts again. Observation is no longer an act, it's a condition. You're not watching yourself think. You're aware of thinking as one process among many. Sensation, memory, perception, intuition all carry equal weight. No single channel dominates. As a result, Internal hierarchy reorganizes. Thoughts lose their automatic authority. Emotions aren't dismissed, but they're no longer treated as directives. Bodily signals are read more accurately without being overridden by interpretation. The system begins to function as a coherent whole rather than a collection of competing parts. You may notice that certain environments feel different now. Spaces you once tolerated may feel subtly misaligned. Others may feel unexpectedly supportive. This isn't preference shifting on the surface. It's resonance being detected more clearly. The system senses where coherence is easier to maintain and where it requires effort. When effort is required, you may choose it consciously rather than enduring it unconsciously. That choice feels cleaner, less draining. When you leave those environments, recovery happens faster. The system returns to baseline without needing extended decompression. There can also be a change in how you experience solitude. Being alone no longer feels like absence or relief. It feels neutral. Presence doesn't depend on stimulation. Silence isn't something to be filled. It carries information of its own. In social contexts, you may notice that you're less compelled to signal who you are. Identity expression softens. You don't disappear. You simply stop reinforcing a fixed image. This can feel freeing, though freedom isn't the dominant sensation. Ease is. Ease doesn't mean everything feels pleasant. It means friction reduces where it isn't necessary. Challenges still exist, but they don't recruit the entire system. They remain localized. You respond where needed and remain at rest elsewhere. The quantum field responds to this distribution of attention. When attention isn't collapsed into a single point of concern, feedback becomes more nuanced. You sense when to engage and when to wait. Timing improves, not because you're strategizing, but because you're listening. Listening here doesn't involve effort. It's not focused concentration. It's openness without agenda. Signals that matter stand out on their own. Signals that don't matter fade into background noise. Discernment happens automatically when internal noise is low. You may also notice a subtle change in how goals feel. Goals don't vanish, but they lose their emotional charge. They become reference points rather than destinations that define worth. Movement toward them happens when conditions align, not when pressure is applied. This shift can feel unsettling if you're accustomed to measuring yourself by progress. Without constant markers, there's a sense of floating. But this floating isn't aimless. It's supported by an underlying current that keeps direction without requiring constant correction. Memory continues to reorganize at this stage. Certain memories surface briefly, not to be reprocessed emotionally, but to be integrated contextually. They slot into a wider pattern and then recede. There's no urge to analyze them. Their relevance resolves on its own. You might notice that language itself feels slightly different. Words carry less weight. You choose them more carefully, not to impress or defend, but to reflect accurately. When accuracy isn't possible, silence becomes an acceptable alternative. Silence doesn't feel like withholding. It feels complete. This completeness extends to rest. When you rest fully. There's less background guilt, less mental commentary about productivity. The system recognizes rest as a functional state, not a deviation. Recovery happens more efficiently when it isn't resisted. At the same time, engagement becomes more focused. When you act with presence. Multitasking loses appeal, not because you've decided against it, but because it fragments coherence. Single-point engagement feels cleaner, more satisfying. The Recode continues to adjust thresholds around stimulation. Loud inputs feel louder, subtle inputs feel clearer. This isn't hypersensitivity, it's calibration. The system is learning to differentiate signal from noise with greater precision. You may become aware that some habits no longer fit. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off. You don't need to eliminate them immediately. Awareness alone begins to loosen their hold. They fall away when they no longer resonate. This process doesn't require vigilance. In fact, vigilance would slow it down. The system works best when left to update in the background. Conscious interference reintroduces old patterns of control. As this part of the integration stabilizes, there's a growing sense that you don't need to monitor the process anymore. It's underway, self-sustaining. Your role isn't to guide it, it's to allow it to continue without interruption. You remain available, present, responsive, not waiting for something to happen, not trying to preserve a state, simply aware of a steadier baseline that holds whether you're paying attention to it or not. And within that steadiness, the system continues its quiet recode, refining how awareness and experience meet, without urgency, without announcement, without needing you to do anything at all. As this steadier baseline holds, you may notice a subtle change in how meaning forms, not as interpretation, but as recognition. Events no longer ask to be explained immediately. They register first as information, then as context, and only later, if necessary, as narrative. This delay doesn't create confusion. It creates accuracy. There is less impulse to personalize what occurs, not because you've detached from experience, but because the system has stopped collapsing everything into self-reference. When something happens, it's allowed to be what it is, before being folded into identity. This alone reduces a significant amount of internal friction you may not have realized was present. You might sense that reactions arise more cleanly now. They begin and end without dragging the rest of the system with them. A moment of irritation doesn't spill into the entire day. A moment of satisfaction doesn't demand extension. Emotional states pass through with defined edges rather than lingering as background noise. This clarity makes it easier to detect when something is actually relevant, not urgent. Relevant. Urgency used to masquerade as importance. Now, importance feels quieter. It doesn't shout for attention. It persists until acknowledged. The system learns to trust persistence over intensity. The observer's position continues to shift. It's no longer centered in the head or the body. It feels distributed. Awareness seems to occupy the entire system evenly, without a focal point. This can feel strange if you're used to locating yourself somewhere specific. But this distribution reduces internal hierarchy. No single sensation dominates. With this distribution comes a new relationship to thought. Thoughts are no longer assumed to be accurate simply because they appear. They're evaluated implicitly by how well they fit the broader pattern. If a thought aligns, it integrates. If it doesn't, it dissolves without resistance. You may notice that certain mental loops no longer complete themselves. They begin, then fade midway, as if the energy required to sustain them isn't available anymore. This isn't suppression, it's a lack of fuel. The system no longer feeds patterns that don't contribute to coherence. There can be a brief period where this feels like loss. Not loss of function, but loss of familiar internal activity. You may notice quieter inner space and expect something to fill it. When nothing does, there's a moment of adjustment. The system learns that emptiness isn't absence, it's capacity. Capacity here doesn't feel expansive or euphoric. It feels neutral and reliable, like a room that's been cleared of clutter. Nothing new has been added, but movement is easier. Navigation requires less effort. You don't bump into things you forgot were there. This clearing often reveals how much of your previous energy went into managing internal contradictions, holding competing narratives, maintaining explanations that no longer fit. As those contradictions dissolve, energy becomes available without being generated. You're not gaining power, you're reclaiming bandwidth. You may notice this reclaimed bandwidth in subtle ways. You listen more fully without trying. You notice details without scanning. You remember things without effort. Attention feels less like a resource that needs conserving and more like a field that supports whatever enters it. The system's relationship to error also changes. Mistakes no longer feel like threats to identity. They register as information, feedback, rather than judgment. This doesn't remove accountability. It removes defensiveness. Correction happens faster when it isn't resisted. There is also a shift in how silence is experienced internally. Silence is no longer something you enter deliberately. It's something that's present whenever thought activity subsides naturally. And when thought returns, silence remains underneath it, unchanged. You don't lose silence when you think. You notice it again when thinking pauses. This continuity reduces the need to seek states. You're no longer trying to return to calm or recreate clarity. Calm and clarity are recognized as conditions that are always available beneath surface activity. This recognition changes how you relate to disturbance. Disturbance becomes localized, temporary. The quantum field continues to provide feedback at this level, but it's subtle. You sense alignment, not as excitement, but as reduced resistance. Things move with fewer obstacles. Timing feels natural. Delays don't provoke anxiety. Acceleration doesn't provoke overconfidence. The system remains even. You may also notice a change in how you relate to choice. Choices feel less dramatic. There's less internal debate. When information is sufficient, choice happens. When it isn't, waiting feels appropriate. The system doesn't rush to fill gaps with assumption. This waiting doesn't feel passive. It feels alert without tension. Like standing still with full awareness rather than pacing. The observer is present without searching. This presence allows subtle cues to register that would have been missed before. As cues register, you may act without preamble. Action emerges cleanly, without build-up. Afterwards, there's no replay. The action completes and releases. The system doesn't revisit it for validation or critique. Completion feels final in a quiet way. This quiet finality extends to many small moments. Conversations end without residue. Tasks finish without mental echoes. Even thoughts conclude without trailing commentary. The system is learning how to close loops efficiently. You may notice that when something truly matters, attention gathers naturally. There's no need to force focus. Focus arises in response to relevance. When relevance fades, focus releases. This elasticity prevents burnout. Attention expands and contracts without damage. Throughout all of this, there's no sense of progression toward a goal. There's only stabilization around a new norm. This norm doesn't require maintenance. It maintains itself by reducing unnecessary effort. If attention drifts away from noticing these shifts, nothing collapses. The system continues operating at this level without supervision. Awareness doesn't need to keep checking itself. Trust has formed, not as belief, but as demonstrated reliability. The recode at this stage is less about change and more about integration. Different parts of the system communicate more efficiently. Signals pass without distortion. Noise is filtered automatically. What remains is a steady, functional coherence that doesn't announce itself. And within that coherence, experience continues. Ordinary, complex, unpredictable, but met with a system that no longer needs to brace against it. Awareness remains open, distributed, and available, allowing each moment to register fully and then pass, without accumulation, without urgency, without needing to be held. As this coherence becomes familiar, you may begin to sense a deeper shift in how the system relates to control. Not relinquishing it entirely, not asserting it more strongly, but redefining what control actually is. Control no longer means managing every variable. It means allowing the system to respond intelligently, without constant oversight. There's a quiet recognition that much of what you once tried to control was never truly controllable. Outcomes, reactions, timing. That realization doesn't bring resignation. It brings precision. Energy stops being spent on influence where none is possible and becomes available where response actually matters. You may notice that when uncertainty appears now, it doesn't immediately trigger mental activity. There's a pause where uncertainty is simply registered. This pause allows the system to sense whether uncertainty requires engagement or can be left alone. Many uncertainties resolve themselves when not interfered with. Others clarify their relevance over time. This discernment reduces internal noise further. You stop carrying unresolved questions as background weight. Questions are allowed to remain open without becoming burdens. Openness itself becomes a stable condition rather than a problem to solve. The observer's stance here is subtle. It doesn't hover. It doesn't withdraw. It remains embedded, aware without monitoring. There's less self-checking, less internal commentary about how things are going. The system trusts its own feedback mechanisms. You may notice that effort now feels more proportional. When effort is required, it's applied directly and briefly. When it's not, it disappears entirely. There's no lingering sense of should be doing more. The absence of that pressure frees up significant mental space. This space doesn't fill with new content. It remains open. And in that openness, perception sharpens. You notice small shifts in mood, environment, and interaction that would have been overlooked before. These shifts don't demand response. They inform orientation. Orientation becomes less conceptual and more somatic. You feel when something fits. You feel when it doesn't. These sensations aren't dramatic. They're subtle signals that guide behavior without explanation. The system trusts these signals more now because they've proven reliable. You may also notice a change in how you relate to effortful states like struggle or ambition. They don't disappear, but they lose their central role. Struggle is recognized as one mode among many, not a default requirement. Ambition becomes contextual rather than constant. This shift can feel like a quiet loss of intensity, but what's actually happening is redistribution. Intensity appears when relevant and recedes when not. It's no longer sustained artificially. This prevents exhaustion and allows recovery to happen naturally. There's also a refinement in how you perceive boundaries. You sense where your responsibility ends and where it begins. This clarity doesn't come from rules or decisions. It comes from reduced entanglement. When you're less entangled, boundaries become self-evident. This self-evidence reduces guilt and obligation, not because you've decided to care less, but because you can see more clearly what is and isn't yours to carry. Carrying less doesn't diminish care. It makes care more precise. You may notice that when someone else is distressed, you don't absorb it automatically. You remain present without merging. This presence can feel more supportive than absorption ever was. You're available without being overwhelmed. The system maintains its coherence while allowing connection. Connection itself changes quality here. It's less about exchange and more about resonance. You sense alignment or misalignment without analysis. When alignment is present, interaction feels effortless. When it's not, effort becomes apparent quickly, and the system responds by adjusting exposure. This adjustment isn't avoidance, it's calibration. You spend more time where coherence is supported and less where it's constantly challenged. This isn't a strategy. It's a natural outcome of clearer signal detection. The timeline you inhabit feels less pressurized. There's less sense of racing toward or away from moments. Events unfold at their own pace, and you meet them where they are. This doesn't remove deadlines or structure. It removes unnecessary acceleration. Acceleration is recognized as a tool rather than a constant state. You use it when needed and release it when not. This flexibility preserves system health. Chronic acceleration is no longer sustainable or attractive. You may notice that rest and activity feel more integrated. Rest isn't something you earn after effort. It's a parallel state that informs activity. Activity draws from rest rather than opposing it. This relationship reduces cycles of depletion and recovery. As this integration stabilizes, the need to name what's happening diminishes. Labels feel less useful. They don't add clarity. They add structure where structure isn't needed. Experience stands on its own without explanation. You might still find yourself reaching for explanation out of habit. When you do, the explanation feels thin. Not wrong, just unnecessary. You can let it go without losing orientation. Orientation no longer depends on understanding. The quantum field continues to interact with the system at this level through subtle feedback. You sense when coherence increases or decreases. You adjust without deliberation. These adjustments are small and continuous, preventing large corrections later. There's a growing sense that nothing here requires maintenance. You don't need to protect this state. Protection would imply fragility. What's present now is resilient because it's efficient. It uses less energy, not more. If disruption occurs, the system responds and then returns to baseline without effort. Baseline is no longer something you have to reach. It's where the system naturally settles when interference stops. This natural settling brings a quiet confidence that doesn't seek expression. You don't feel the need to announce stability or demonstrate clarity. Those impulses belong to earlier configurations where validation was required to reinforce internal states. Now, validation is internal, but not self-generated. It arises from consistent experience. The system knows what it can handle because it has handled it repeatedly without strain. As this knowing deepens, there's less concern about maintaining coherence in the future. Future coherence isn't planned, it's trusted. Trust here isn't belief. It's familiarity with the system's capacity to self-regulate. The recode at this stage is almost complete. Not in the sense of finishing, but in the sense of becoming background. It no longer draws attention. It simply operates, adjusting, refining, responding. And you remain within this operation, not as someone managing a process, but as awareness moving through experience with less resistance. Nothing needs to be added. Nothing needs to be removed. The system continues to function, quietly aligned, allowing each moment to arrive, register, and pass without accumulation, without urgency, and without needing to be held in place. With the system now operating from this quieter coherence, you may begin to sense a subtle shift in how significance is assigned. Not everything feels equally important, but importance is no longer tied to scale or visibility. Small moments can carry weight. Large events can pass with minimal impact. Significance becomes contextual rather than absolute. This contextual sense removes pressure from experience. You no longer feel the need to extract meaning from everything that happens. Some moments are simply moments. Others resonate more deeply, and that resonance is felt immediately, without analysis. The system knows when something matters, and it doesn't confuse that knowing with urgency. You may notice that anticipation has changed form. It no longer projects forward aggressively. Instead, it feels like a quiet readiness. The body remains relaxed while attention stays available. This readiness doesn't lean toward outcome. It remains open to what actually arrives. Because of this openness, surprise feels different now. When something unexpected occurs, it doesn't destabilize the system. There's a brief recalibration, then integration. Surprise becomes information rather than disruption. The system adjusts without losing balance. There can be moments where you realize how much effort once went into maintaining a sense of continuity, making sure experiences fit a coherent story, explaining deviations, justifying changes. That effort fades here. Continuity is no longer enforced. It emerges naturally from moment to moment. This natural continuity allows identity to soften further. You don't feel fragmented, but you feel less defined. The edges of self-concept blur slightly, not into confusion, but into flexibility. You can move through different contexts without needing to recalibrate who you are each time. You may notice that your internal language becomes simpler. Fewer qualifiers, fewer explanations. Thoughts arrive closer to sensation, less abstracted. When abstraction appears, it serves a function and then releases. It doesn't linger as background commentary. The observer now operates almost invisibly. You're aware without noticing that you're aware. This absence of self-reference allows experience to unfold without being constantly mirrored back. There's less internal echo. Moments feel complete in themselves. You might sense that the body responds more quickly to internal cues. Hunger, fatigue, interest, disengagement. These signals are detected earlier, before they intensify. Responding to them becomes easier because they haven't escalated into demands. This early detection reduces extremes. You don't push until exhaustion. You don't withdraw until overwhelm. Adjustments happen incrementally. The system stays within a comfortable range without needing correction. There is also a subtle change in how you relate to effortful learning or adaptation. When something new is required, you engage without resistance. When repetition is no longer useful, you disengage without guilt. Learning becomes situational rather than aspirational. This situational approach removes pressure to improve continuously. Improvement happens when relevant. Plateauing is accepted when appropriate. The system doesn't demand constant optimization. It values stability as much as growth. You may notice that comparison loses relevance. Not because you've decided it's unhealthy, but because it doesn't provide useful information anymore. Comparing internal states to external appearances doesn't yield actionable signal. The system stops doing it automatically. Without comparison, self-assessment changes. You sense your own state directly, rather than through reference points. This direct sensing is more accurate and less emotionally charged. You know when something is off, and when it's aligned without needing confirmation. The quantum field continues to interact subtly here, not as an external force, but as a shared context. You sense that experience isn't isolated. Patterns extend beyond individual moments. This sensing doesn't lead to speculation. It leads to humility. Awareness recognizes its place within a larger system without needing to define that system. Humility here doesn't feel like diminishment. It feels like relief. You're no longer required to be the central organizing principle of experience. You participate without controlling the whole. This participation is lighter. You may notice that when challenges arise, you meet them without dramatization. There's less internal buildup, less anticipation of difficulty. You address what's present and move on. This doesn't eliminate difficulty. It eliminates unnecessary amplification. Amplification once served a purpose. It ensured attention. Now attention is available without amplification. The system no longer needs to shout internally to be heard. As a result, emotional responses become more proportionate. Strong emotions still occur when warranted, but they don't spill into unrelated areas. They complete their cycle and release. The system returns to baseline smoothly. This baseline is now familiar. It doesn't feel special. It feels normal. That normality is a sign of integration. What once felt like a shift is now simply how things are. You might notice that you don't think about the process much anymore. When you do, it feels distant, like recalling a transition that has already passed. The system doesn't need reminders. It's already operating from the updated configuration. Even when old patterns surface briefly, they don't take hold. They're recognized quickly and allowed to dissolve. There's no struggle. Recognition is enough. You may also sense a growing patience that isn't tied to waiting for something specific. It's patience with process itself, an understanding that systems unfold in their own time when not forced. This patience doesn't slow action when action is needed. It prevents premature action. Premature action once created friction. Now, timing feels more accurate. You act when information is sufficient and refrain when it isn't. This accuracy reduces regret. Decisions feel clean, even when outcomes are uncertain. The system's relationship to uncertainty continues to evolve. Uncertainty is no longer something to eliminate. It's a condition that allows new information to emerge. When uncertainty is tolerated, options remain open longer, leading to more appropriate responses. You may notice that this tolerance extends to internal uncertainty as well. Not knowing how you feel about something immediately doesn't create discomfort. Feelings clarify when given space. Forcing clarity too soon often distorts it. This allowance creates a gentler internal climate. There's less pressure to define, decide, or declare. Experience unfolds at its own pace. Awareness stays with it without pushing. As this gentleness stabilizes, the system feels less defended, not exposed, but open. Openness here doesn't invite overwhelm because boundaries are clear. The system knows what it can engage with and what it should let pass. This discernment continues, operating without conscious management. It's embedded now. The recode has moved fully into background operation. You remain present within this operation, not monitoring, not guiding, simply available. And as availability becomes the default, experience continues to flow through a system that no longer needs to brace, accelerate, or explain itself. Each moment arrives, registers, and completes, leaving no residue, no urgency, and no requirement to be anything other than what is already occurring. With this background coherence now fully established, you may notice a subtle but profound change in how the system relates to persistence. Not endurance in the sense of pushing through, but continuity without strain. Experience continues, and you continue with it, without the sense that something must be sustained manually. There is a quiet realization that effort was never the source of stability. Effort was a compensatory response to misalignment. As alignment stabilizes, effort naturally decreases. What remains is responsiveness. The system stays ready, not tense. You may notice that when something truly requires attention, attention gathers instantly. There's no internal debate, no negotiation. The response is immediate and proportional. Once the response is complete, attention releases just as cleanly. There's no lingering vigilance. This responsiveness changes how you experience responsibility. Responsibility no longer feels like a weight carried forward in time. It becomes a moment-by-moment engagement. You respond when it's present. When it passes fully. You don't carry it beyond its relevance. The observer now feels less like a position and more like a condition. Awareness doesn't shift locations. It doesn't zoom in and out deliberately. It remains evenly distributed, allowing perception to adjust automatically. This even distribution prevents fixation. Fixation once narrowed experience and amplified stress. Without it, the system remains flexible. Flexibility here isn't indecision. It's adaptability without loss of integrity. You can adjust without feeling compromised. You may notice that integrity itself feels different. It's no longer tied to consistency of behavior across contexts. It's tied to internal coherence. When coherence is present, behavior adapts naturally without feeling contradictory. When coherence dips, inconsistency is felt immediately, not as guilt, but as signal. This signal is gentle. It doesn't accuse. It informs. And because it's gentle, it's listened to. Harsh signals were often ignored or resisted. Subtle ones integrate more easily. There's also a shift in how memory is stored. Experiences don't stack as heavily. They don't accumulate as unresolved layers. Each experience registers, informs, and then settles into context. Memory becomes lighter, less burdensome. This lightness affects imagination as well. Imagined futures no longer carry the same emotional load. They're considered without being inhabited. You can think about what might happen without living there prematurely. This prevents emotional depletion. You may notice that your sense of scale has adjusted. Problems feel smaller, not because they are trivial, but because they're seen within a wider field. That wider field doesn't minimize difficulty. It contextualizes it. Contextualization reduces overwhelm. When something is seen in isolation, it can feel all-encompassing. When seen within a broader pattern, it finds its proper place. The system does this automatically now, without conscious reframing. You might sense that the body participates more actively in this contextualization. Sensations are read as information rather than alarms. Tension is noticed early. Release happens naturally. The body no longer needs to escalate signals to be heard. This improved communication between body and awareness reduces extremes. You don't reach exhaustion before resting. You don't suppress discomfort until it becomes pain. Adjustments happen in smaller increments. As a result, resilience increases. Not dramatic resilience, but quiet durability. The system recovers quickly from disruption. It returns to baseline without intervention. Baseline itself feels reliable. You may notice that external circumstances no longer dictate internal state as directly. There's a buffer now, not a wall, but a filter. Information passes through without overwhelming. This filter isn't selective in a conscious way. It's selective through relevance. Relevance becomes the primary organizing principle. What matters receives attention. What doesn't fades. This isn't avoidance, it's efficiency. The system conserves energy by not engaging unnecessarily. You may also notice a reduction in internal storytelling. Events don't immediately become narratives about who you are or what things mean. They remain events until meaning is actually needed. This reduces distortion. When meaning does form, it feels grounded. It doesn't spiral. It doesn't seek reinforcement. It integrates and settles. The system doesn't revisit it repeatedly. This settling creates a sense of quiet completion around many things that once felt open-ended. Conversations, decisions, experiences. They conclude without residue. You don't replay them. You don't refine them internally. They end. Endings no longer feel abrupt or premature. They feel appropriate. The system recognizes when something is complete without needing external confirmation. You may notice that this recognition extends to phases of life, not just moments. Certain concerns lose relevance without fanfare. Interests shift without crisis. You don't mark transitions dramatically. They happen. This natural transition reduces fear around change. Change no longer feels like loss of control. It feels like reorientation. The system adapts without needing to be convinced. The quantum field continues to interact at this level through subtle synchronization, not coincidences to be interpreted, but alignments that reduce friction. Things line up just enough to support coherence without drawing attention to themselves. You may sense that timing improves. You arrive when needed, you leave when complete. There's less second-guessing, less wondering if you stayed too long or moved too soon. The system senses closure accurately. This accuracy builds trust. Trust not in outcomes, but in process. You trust that you'll sense when adjustment is needed. You trust that you'll respond appropriately. This trust doesn't require optimism. It's grounded in repeated experience. You may also notice that when the system is challenged beyond its current capacity, it signals clearly. Fatigue is honest. Confusion is temporary. You don't push through blindly. You pause, recalibrate, and continue. This ability to pause without collapse is significant. Pausing no longer feels like failure, it feels like intelligence. The system knows when to stop without needing external permission. As this intelligence stabilizes, there's less interest in measuring where you are relative to anything else. Progress, regression, advancement. These concepts feel abstract. Experience feels concrete. You remain engaged with life, but less preoccupied with managing it. You participate without micromanaging. You respond without over-identifying. The recode at this stage is fully integrated. It doesn't feel like something that happened. It feels like how things work. There's no need to revisit it, reinforce it, or protect it. And as this part of the process settles, the system rests in a state that doesn't require explanation. Awareness remains present, responsive, and unburdened. Experience continues to move through, moment by moment, without accumulation. Nothing is being prepared for, nothing is being concluded. The system simply operates, quietly aligned, allowing whatever arises to register, resolve, and pass, leaving behind a steadiness that no longer needs to be noticed to remain intact. There is nothing left to arrive at. What you are sensing now does not point forward or backward. It settles, it stabilizes, it rests where it is without needing to become anything else. The system no longer searches for confirmation that something has completed. Completion isn't marked by a feeling or a realization. It's marked by the absence of friction, by how little effort it takes to remain exactly where awareness already is. You may notice that even the impulse to reflect on what has changed feels unnecessary. Reflection was useful when orientation was unclear. Now orientation is implicit. You don't need to look at it to know it's there. Thoughts continue to appear, but they no longer pull awareness into motion. They arise, register, and dissolve into the same field they came from. Silence is no longer something you enter. It's what remains when nothing needs to be processed. There is a quiet sense of enoughness here. Not satisfaction, not fulfillment, simply enough. The system isn't waiting for resolution because it isn't holding an unresolved state. It isn't reaching because it isn't lacking. You may notice that attention no longer grips the edges of experience. It rests in the center without effort. When something moves into relevance, attention meets it. When relevance fades, attention releases. This rhythm doesn't require management. The observer is no longer distinct from what is observed, not merged in a dramatic way, just undivided. Awareness doesn't step back to watch. It remains present as experience unfolds. This presence doesn't feel heightened. It feels ordinary. That ordinariness is the signal that integration is complete. When something extraordinary remains extraordinary, it hasn't fully settled. What has settled feels normal. The body reflects this normality. Breathing moves without being noticed. Muscles hold only what's required. Stillness doesn't feel imposed. Movement doesn't feel driven. Everything operates within a comfortable range without correction. Time no longer feels like something you're inside of or outside of. It passes. You notice it when necessary and ignore it when it's irrelevant. The system uses time without being used by it. You may notice that there is no urge to preserve this state. Preservation implies threat. There is no threat here. What's present doesn't depend on conditions being just right. It persists through variation. If disruption arises, it is met. If clarity fades briefly, it returns. Nothing essential is lost in fluctuation. The system knows how to recenter without effort. This knowing doesn't feel like confidence. It feels like familiarity. You've been here before, even if you didn't recognize it. What's different now is that the system no longer leaves this state automatically. There is no narrative to carry forward, no lesson to remember, no instruction embedded in the experience. It stands on its own, without needing interpretation. You may notice that even listening feels optional now, not because attention is drifting, but because nothing is being asked of it. Awareness remains open, whether or not it's directed. The quiet recognition that remains doesn't point outward. It doesn't signal action. It simply confirms stability, the kind of stability that doesn't lock anything in place. Nothing needs to be held. Nothing needs to be released. What passes, passes. What remains, remains. And as this continues, without effort and without demand, awareness stays exactly where it is present, unforced and sufficient, allowing each moment to arrive and complete itself, naturally, without urgency, without commentary, and without any need to mark an ending.